It was supposed to be a normal day. James Carter, a 62-year-old black man, had no idea that his routine trip to the bank would turn into something he'd never forget. Dressed in a plain shirt and slacks, he wore a U.S. Army veteran cap with quiet pride. The cap wasn't just for show. It represented over 3 decades of service, sacrifices made overseas, and a life dedicated to defending a country that didn't always defend him. That morning, James had walked into the downtown branch of National First Bank with a check in his hand and a calm smile on his face. He'd recently sold a vintage motorcycle, a hobby he had picked up after retirement, and was ready to deposit part of the sale and cash the rest for bills and household expenses. The bank was moderately busy, with a handful of people scattered across the floor, some waiting in line, others seated in the lounge area. James took his place at the back of the line and waited patiently, nodding politely to a few customers as they passed by. But it didn't take long before he noticed something odd. The teller glanced at him, then again, and again. A hushed conversation followed between 2 bank employees. James wasn't causing a scene, wasn't loud, wasn't doing anything suspicious, yet he could feel the weight of eyes lingering on him. That's when a woman in a gray blazer and heels approached him, walking with sharp, clipped steps. Her name read Susan, and her tone was even sharper than her stride. "Excuse me," she said, folding her arms. "Can I help you with something?" James blinked, a little confused by the tone. "Yes, ma'am. Just here to cash a check." Susan frowned. "Do you have an account here?" "Yes. Been with this bank for years," he replied, reaching into his jacket to pull out his ID and check. She barely glanced at the documents before responding, "This check looks off, and this ID doesn't seem quite right." James was stunned. "Ma'am, it's a government-issued ID. That's me, James Carter. The check's from a verified buyer. You can call the number on the back if you'd like." But Susan didn't appear interested in verifying anything. Her expression had already shifted from suspicion to outright distrust. Without another word, she stepped back toward the counter, picked up the phone, and spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I'm calling the police." The entire bank seemed to freeze. Customers looked around, unsure of what was happening. A young couple whispered to each other. A man near the ATM stared in disbelief. James stood still, his veteran instincts telling him not to escalate things. But inside he was shaken, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he'd seen this story before. Too many times. He tried again. "Ma'am, please. I'm a veteran. You can verify the check. My account's in good standing." But Susan cut him off. "Sir, I'm asking you to wait here until the authorities arrive. For everyone's safety." James looked down at the check in his hand. It was clean, clearly printed, and completely legal. Everything he was doing was by the book. And yet, he was being treated like a criminal. In that moment, James Carter wasn't a man who had risked his life for his country. He wasn't a grandfather, or a husband, or a homeowner. In Susan's eyes, he was just suspicious. The minutes dragged. No one said anything. Some watched in silence. Others pretended not to see. James took a deep breath. This wasn't his first time facing injustice, but something about this moment felt different. He had no idea what was about to happen next would leave the entire bank speechless. Police arrive, but something feels off. In under 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights lit up the street outside the bank. 2 uniformed police officers walked in, their presence immediately silencing the already tense room. Customers turned their heads. A mother pulled her child a little closer. The air was thick with discomfort, but the man at the center of it all, James Carter, stood tall and still. He had faced far worse in life. He'd been in combat zones overseas, had led soldiers through life-or-death missions. But this, being treated like a criminal in his own country, in broad daylight, because of the color of his skin, this hit different. "Sir, we received a call about a fraudulent check," one officer said carefully, approaching James. James remained calm, even as his heart pounded. "No problem, officer," he said, his voice steady. "Here's my ID, my military papers, and the check in question. Everything's in order." He handed them over without hesitation. The officers took the documents and stepped aside to look them over. James could hear whispers from a few nearby customers. Some were clearly uncomfortable with how this was unfolding, but no one spoke up. After a few minutes, the taller officer looked up from the documents, then exchanged a glance with his partner. Something wasn't adding up, and it wasn't with James. The check had clear details. The ID matched. The military documentation was official. Nothing suggested anything illegal. In fact, the check wasn't unusually large. It was well within what a person might deposit after selling a vehicle. The officer turned to the bank manager. "Ma'am," he said, his tone changing, "did you run this through your system? Did you even try verifying the check before calling us?" Susan, arms folded and expression hard, replied curtly, "I trusted my instincts. Something about it just didn't look right." There was again instincts, not policy, not procedure, just bias. The officer frowned. He looked back at James, standing quietly near the counter, hands behind his back in a posture that looked almost military. There was no aggression, no threat, just quiet strength. "Sir," the officer said to James, lowering his voice, "can you tell me what happened from your side?" James nodded and calmly explained how he'd come in, presented his documents, and was met with suspicion almost immediately. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a disturbance. All he had done was try to cash a check from his own account. The officer listened carefully, then excused himself and stepped outside. The door closed behind him. Inside the bank, the tension continued to rise. Susan, still standing by the counter, looked uneasy for the first time. Her confidence was starting to crack, but she kept her arms tightly folded. The customers, meanwhile, began murmuring quietly. One man whispered to another, "He's a vet? Seriously?" An elderly woman, seated near the exit, muttered, "He doesn't deserve this. This is just wrong." Back outside, the officer was on the phone. But this wasn't just a standard follow-up call to HQ. He dialed a number he rarely used, one tied to military contacts and high-ranking personnel. There was something in James's demeanor, his ID, his story, that stirred a gut feeling in the officer. Not suspicion, but respect. After a brief conversation, the officer ended the call and looked toward the bank's front doors. A few more minutes passed. Then, from around the corner, a sleek black SUV pulled up. The driver stepped out briskly, followed by a man whose presence turned every head in the building as soon as he stepped inside. He wore a military uniform with crisp lines, gleaming medals, and 4 silver stars on his shoulders. He was a 4-star general, and he wasn't just any general. He was someone who knew James Carter personally. The entire bank, Susan included, was about to witness a moment they'd never forget. Just minutes after the officer stepped outside to make that mysterious call, a sleek black SUV turned the corner and rolled to a stop directly in front of the bank. Its windows were tinted, its paint polished to a mirror finish. Everyone in the bank turned to look, sensing something unusual was about to happen. The doors of the vehicle opened, and out stepped a tall, imposing figure dressed in full military uniform. His posture was upright, his steps precise. On his shoulders gleamed 4 silver stars, symbols of one of the highest ranks in the United States Army. His chest bore rows of medals, campaign ribbons, and commendations earned from decades of service. He wasn't just some officer. He was General Anthony Richardson, a name that carried weight both in military circles and beyond. Few could claim his level of leadership and respect. Even fewer were still active at his rank. And now, this powerful figure was walking through the glass doors of the bank, headed straight for James Carter. The room fell into stunned silence. The tension that had filled the space just moments before was replaced with wide eyes, dropped jaws, and a wave of curiosity. No one knew what to say. Even the officer who had made the call stood up straighter as the general entered. The general's eyes scanned the room briefly. He wasn't here for small talk. Then he saw James. The hardened look on his face immediately softened. A smile broke through the seriousness. "James," he said warmly, walking toward him, "sorry I'm late." James straightened his back a bit, returning the smile. "You're never late, sir. Just in time." Gasps echoed across the lobby. You could practically hear the thoughts running through people's heads. Wait, he knows him? Personally? Susan, the bank manager, stood frozen behind the counter. Her face had gone pale. She looked from James to the general, blinking rapidly. "Why, you know him?" she stammered. General Richardson turned slowly to face her, his eyes narrowing slightly. His voice was calm, but sharp, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Yes, I know him very well," the general said firmly. "This man served under my command. I trust him with my life. So let me ask you something." He stepped a little closer, his metals catching the light. "Exactly what did you accuse him of?" Susan stumbled over her words. I thought the check looked suspicious. And his ID, I didn't think it matched." "You didn't think it matched?" the general echoed. "Did you check it? Verify it? Follow protocol? Or did you just see a black man with a large check and decide he was a criminal?" Susan opened her mouth but had no words. There was no excuse, and everyone in that bank knew it. The customers, silent a moment ago, began murmuring again. But this time, they weren't whispering in doubt. They were whispering in disgust. One woman shook her head and said loudly, "Disgraceful. He's a hero." General Richardson wasn't finished. James Carter served this country for 32 years. He earned Bronze Stars, led troops in combat, and helped rebuild entire communities overseas. And now, after all that, he's treated like a threat in his own country. He paused, then added with a chilling finality, "You didn't just insult him. You insulted all of us." The bank manager was speechless. Her authority, her assumptions, and her arrogance had just been shattered by the truth and by someone whose status she couldn't ignore or dismiss. James stood quietly through it all, not with vengeance in his heart, but with quiet strength in his soul. This moment wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And now, everyone in that building understood that. Susan, the bank manager, looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She stammered, her eyes darting around as the weight of her actions began to set in. I just thought he didn't look like someone who would have a check that big," she mumbled, her voice barely above a whisper. But those words hit the room like a slap. The general froze for a beat. His expression hardened again. He took a single step forward, now standing squarely in front of Susan, towering over her with calm, undeniable authority. And then he spoke, not with rage, but with the full power of righteous anger, his voice ringing across the bank loud enough for every single person to hear. "You didn't think a black man could be successful?" Susan didn't respond. "You didn't think a decorated veteran, who gave his life to this country, who served with honor and distinction, could walk into a bank without being treated like a threat?" No one moved. No one spoke. The silence was louder than the sirens that had arrived earlier. General Richardson's voice trembled, not from weakness, but from emotion. "This man," he continued, gesturing to James, "has done more for this nation than most ever will. He's been shot at, bombed, and nearly killed defending freedoms that allow you to sit behind a desk and make judgments based on skin color." Susan's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She knew. Everyone knew. The general wasn't just defending James. He was holding up a mirror to a broken part of society that too many pretend doesn't exist. He turned to the room, now filled with customers watching intently. Some had their phones out. Others had tears in their eyes. "I'm ashamed this happened," he said, his voice softer now, but still firm. "Ashamed that in the very country we fought for, men like James still have to prove they belong, just to cash a check." He looked back at Susan. "You owe him not only an apology, but respect." Susan, her voice barely a whisper, finally said, I'm sorry, but it was too late. The damage had already been done, and the world was watching." One young man, near the ATM, had recorded the entire encounter. Another woman had started live streaming. As the general spoke, the words spread across social media in real time. "This is what black veterans go through," someone tweeted. "General just schooled this racist bank manager live." Another post read. A third user simply wrote, #Justice for James. Customers began shaking their heads, visibly uncomfortable with what they'd just witnessed. A few gathered their belongings and left without finishing their transactions, clearly not wanting to support a business that treated a veteran like a criminal. One woman, holding a small child, looked directly at Susan and said, "You need to do better." "We all do." James, still silent through much of the confrontation, finally spoke up, not with anger, but with grace. "I didn't come here for trouble," he said, looking around the room. "I came here to cash a check. That's all. But if this moment makes one person think twice before judging someone by their skin, then maybe it was worth it." A round of quiet applause broke out. Small, respectful, but powerful. The general placed a firm hand on James's shoulder and nodded. "We've got your back, soldier," he said. And just like that, the narrative had changed, not just in that bank, but across the internet, and possibly across the hearts of those who watched it unfold. This wasn't just about one man, one check, or one bank. It was about something much bigger, and the world was finally paying attention. Within just a few hours of the confrontation at National First Bank, the story exploded across the internet. The video, captured by a bystander on their phone, began spreading like wildfire. In it, James Carter, a 62-year-old black veteran, was seen calmly handing over his ID and check, only to be accused of fraud. Then, the moment that made the world stop, General Anthony Richardson, a four-star officer in full uniform, walking through the bank doors to stand by his former soldier's side. People couldn't believe what they were seeing. "This is heartbreaking and inspiring," one person commented. "Imagine serving your country and still being treated like a suspect," wrote another. The hashtag Justice for James began trending on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Influencers shared the video. Veterans groups reposted it. Civil rights advocates began speaking out. By the end of the day, the video had racked up over 8 million views, with thousands demanding accountability. Anger built quickly. News outlets picked up the story almost immediately. The footage made it to national television. Headlines blared across morning broadcasts. Veteran accused of fraud while trying to cash a check. Four-star general confronts bank over racial profiling. Hashtag Justice for James. Viral video sparks outrage and conversation. Faced with mounting public pressure, National First Bank released a brief statement later that evening. In it, they acknowledged the incident and announced that the manager involved, Susan, had been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. But for many, that wasn't nearly enough. "Administrative leave? That's a slap on the wrist," one commenter wrote. "How many more people like James have faced this?" "Off camera," another user added. Protests were quickly organized outside the bank's downtown branch. People held signs that read, "Veterans deserve respect, color is not a crime, and do better, America." James, however, didn't react with rage. He was later interviewed by a local news station. Sitting on a modest chair in his home, surrounded by photos of his service days and family, he didn't sound bitter, he sounded hopeful. "I don't want revenge," James said, looking directly into the camera. "I want awareness. I want people to know that this stuff still happens. It doesn't matter if you're in uniform or if you serve your country. There are still people out there who look at a black man and see a problem, not a person." He paused, then added, "I'm not the only one. There are thousands of people who've gone through something like this and never had a camera rolling. Let this story be a wake-up call." By his side sat General Richardson, who also spoke during the interview. "This country needs more people like James," he said, his tone serious but calm. "Not just in uniform, but in everyday life. James represents strength, dignity, and patience. He kept calm in a moment when many others wouldn't. But the truth is, he shouldn't have had to." The general looked directly at the reporter. "Let's stop treating heroes like criminals. Let's stop assuming the worst when we see someone who doesn't fit the profile. Let's be better, starting today." The interview went viral too. James's message began appearing on t-shirts, posters, and even classroom discussions. Schools used the video as part of lessons on bias and racial profiling. Veterans organizations issued public support. A GoFundMe was even started, not because James asked for it, but because people wanted to give back. It raised over $250,000 in a week. But James didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted change. And thanks to that one moment in a small downtown bank, the world finally started to listen.